Good evening, you guys. I want to talk to you a little bit about Isaiah 26 and why that sounds so much like the rapture. We talked about it at the very beginning of quarantine, how, it just so resonated. Come, my people, enter your chambers, hide yourself, as it were, for a little while until the judgments have passed. Talks about how the Lord will come forth out of his dwelling place to judge the world. It talks about how when judgments are upon the earth, the people of the earth learn righteousness, so that we discover that it's truly a grace period that God has given the earth to bring us to himself, quarantine us off, and to help us learn through this insecurity how to trust in him, how to, I'd say, closing down a lot of these distractions of movies and sports and entertainment. All of this has caused people to become more introspective, and many people are reporting that they're discovering their faith during this time. So, but it goes on to say that when grace is extended to the wicked, that they do not learn righteousness. So people who are truly, exercising really, evil things, involved in real evil, they're only hardening their hearts, and they're not learning righteousness at this time. So it just feels like a divine separation is taking place. I mean, it's almost like, and we're also being introduced to so many things that we didn't even know, understanding about, child trafficking, the extent of which, of what's happening to these kids and things like that. It's like we're, when Jesus comes to separate the sheep from the goats, I mean, it's like we've already, to some extent, already gravitated to our own line. When you're considering 9-month abortion, when you're considering these things and you start defending this, and you're gravitating to one line. You really are. I mean, he is so gracious and so kind that he lets us choose our own line. I think when you start gravitating towards righteousness, then he gives you more and more grace. When you start gravitating towards unrighteousness, then he allows your heart to even be more hardened. That's why we have to be very careful what we are approving of. But anyway, he says during this time that all these judgments upon the earth, talks about how he will keep those in perfect peace whose minds are stayed upon him, because they trust in him. They're putting their trust in him. And he also talks about how the way of the righteous during this hour will be smooth. Their paths will be level. And so he's making a distinction about what's going on in the hearts and minds and the realities of both people groups. So it talks also about, I've talked about extending the borders during this time. That is specifically at the beginning of the chapter, it talks about Judah. That would be Bethlehem. That would be the West Bank, what is exactly on the table for Israel to annex during this time. Of course, they won it. I don't remember if it's the Yom Kippur War or the Six-Day War, but they did truly win that by being attacked. We know in the Bible days, no one can deny Bethlehem, was part of Israel. But they have compromised, and they have given up land for peace, and recognizing that they have no security if they continue not to have at least security forces to protect them from people who are shooting and rockets and incendiary devices and everything coming across the borders. So it talks about extending the borders during this time, and specifically from the land of Judah, opening the gates. Just one moment, guys. Please give me just a moment. Okay, I'm on my fourth take here. So anyway, it also talks about, it compares it to the people, it talks about the people coming to God, and compares it to a woman in labor. How people will come to God in their distress during this time as a woman in labor, but will only give birth to the wind, because it talks about how we ourselves as a people we do not bring salvation on the earth. We cannot bring salvation upon the earth, that only God can. So we're recognizing that as well. So like the charismatic movement that I have, even in my own life, to some degree experienced, a lot of that seems to believe that we bring a certain amount of salvation, the kingdom here, to ourselves. We ourselves bring it to earth, or that's our responsibility. Well, Isaiah 26 talks about how our worldly leaders, our earthly leaders, are just a breath. They're just a vapor. They come, they go, and how we, in our own efforts, cannot even establish and bring salvation upon the earth. So that highlights that it has to be God Himself, Jesus Himself, the Prince of Peace, who's going to bring the salvation to the earth. So let's see if I've missed anything. Talks about, I don't always have notes, but this time I desperately need notes for all of this. Talks about the high city, the lofty city being laid low, and being trampled underfoot by the poor, by the needy, by the oppressed, by the homeless, by the, you just visualize maybe New York City, which of course experienced a judgment during the 9/11, at a time when, if you read The Harbinger by Jonathan Cahn, it talks about how that God visits the judgments upon a nation that has been dedicated to God at the place of that dedication. So, of course, with Israel, it happened at the temple. With America, it happened at Ground Zero, because the original chapel where America was dedicated to God is on the Twin Towers are sitting on the original property of that chapel. And remember how the towers came down and that tiny chapel wasn't even harmed, which everyone was talking about. That's the miracle of 9/11. So if you've not read The Harbinger, that's really, 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 really eye-opening. But he also explains how that if we do not turn and repent as a nation, that judgment will be finalized the next time. And so people have talked about how New York City, there's actually an area in New York referred to as Babylon. And so the high and lofty city of Isaiah 26, you wonder if that is New York City. So I'm just trying to see if I have missed anything in this chapter to go over. It seems like from beginning to end, from discussing the borders of Israel, discussing the dead, it says the earth will cast forth its dead. Your dead will live. Arise like the dew of the morning. Like it talks about how the dead are going to come back to life, and the earth is going to cast them out. Of course, that happens, at the rapture. And then it also talks about how the earth will disclose during this time of judgment. Right during the time it's talking about us being in quarantine, basically, hiding ourselves for a little while. It talks about how the earth will disclose its bloodshed and no longer hide its slain. And that so reminds me of the draining of the swamp, of course, and the fact that so much evil, especially the harming of children, is all being just disclosed right now. It's like we're all finding out about it for the first time, and it's all being revealed. So, Isaiah 26, from beginning to end, can't think of not anything that is not relevant to today and to the here and now. And so I've talked to you before about how, so much of things that we've witnessed in the past, we may have overlooked as being meaningful. But anyway, praying for all of you guys. I look forward to doing another video soon, and you guys be blessed.